The Sydney suburban network has received lots of bad press in recent months, owing to its perceived poor reliability. For a long time, I've advocated for increased investment in the suburban network, but I haven't seen any government plans which would have helped alleviate the issues plaguing the core of Sydney trains, namely constrained infrastructure and unreliable signalling. I have since, however, seen pages from a leaked Cabinet in Confidence report detailing the medium-term vision for the suburban rail network. This document includes extensive infrastructure and signalling upgrades and massive increases in service frequencies, whilst significantly improving operational resilience of the network. In this video, I'll unpack the information contained in the pages I've seen from the document and explain the impact it will have on services. I'll run through each line in numerical order, detailing the infrastructure changes, then service changes. Normally, I prefer to use current operational sectors. However, the crux of this plan is removing large sections of interlining, such that lines operate more or less independently of each other, reducing the chance of delays cascading to other lines, as happens currently. I will show you the actual map from the document, but when explaining individual lines, I'll use my own diagrams. Coloured diamonds indicate the number of trains per hour starting from that location, or on a shuttle, and black squares are the total number of trains per hour past that location. I'm not showing express or stopping services anywhere, so you'll just have to bear that in mind. I'll also have a separate map as we go along, showing locations of new infrastructure and likely locations of upgraded signalling. T1 would receive extended quad track from St Mary's to Penrith and a new turnback platform at Emu Plains. The line would likely receive ETCS Level 2 cab signalling as far as Strathfield, possibly all the way to Penrith on the suburban quad track lines. This would enable the service expansion from an off-peak 4 trains an hour, with 2 extending to Emu Plains, to 12 trains an hour, with 4 of those extending to Emu Plains. These services would run all stops to Blacktown, then run on an express pattern to Sydney Terminal via the main lines from Strathfield to Sydney Terminal. I'm uncertain of the exact pattern, but it'll have no more stops than the current service. There wouldn't be additional peak services, and that's a common trend that you'll see more of later. However, the current peak frequency is only 8 trains an hour, so it's still a 4 trains an hour increase. The Richmond service would be moved to T9, as well as the North Shore line. The Blue Mountains line would receive 2 trains an hour off-peak and 4 trains an hour on-peak, compared with 1 train an hour off-peak today, and would benefit from separation from suburban stopping trains between Penrith and Blacktown. Combining T1, T9 Richmond and BMT, there is a peak frequency of 28 trains an hour and an off-peak frequency of 20 trains an hour from Blacktown to the city. T2 wouldn't have any infrastructure changes, but would be fitted with full ETCS Level 2 with ATO. Service would be greatly changed to what it is now. 12 trains an hour would start at Revesby, run all stops to the city via the airport tunnel, and then the city circle, the only line to use both of these, before running all stops to Homebush on the local lines. Service west of Homebush is transferred to T9 and T5, and T8 is removed from the airport tunnel. This is to keep T2 on its own tracks along its entire route to improve reliability. It would, however, return Homebush to having only eastbound service. Like T1, there is no planned peak increase. Service through the city circle is actually cut by this plan by 8 trains an hour on peak, and stations like Newtown, currently served by 16 trains an hour on peak, are cut by 4 trains an hour on peak. But service through the airport tunnel and on the Homebush all stops is increased by 4 trains an hour, and on the Revesby local by 8 trains an hour. Off-peak service is increased on the entire line except the city circle, which is unchanged, with the Revesby and Homebush locals benefiting 8 trains an hour and the airport tunnel benefiting 4 trains an hour. T3 would be cut back to a Liverpool to Lidcombe shuttle. Whilst this may displease the users of the line, removing the flat crossing at Lidcombe provides enormous benefit to timetabling. Passengers between Liverpool and Cabramatta can use the new T5 tunnel and Metro West to reach the city, with a massive time saving, and passengers between Cabramatta and Lidcombe can change at Lidcombe for T9 trains to the city, again with a time saving. Softening the blow of this change is the increase in service from 2 trains an hour off-peak and 4 trains an hour on-peak to 4 trains an hour all week. T4 is the first line with a truly enormous benefit. Extended quad track from Hurstville to Sutherland and full rollout of ETCS Level 2 with ATO would allow a completely self-contained metro-style all-stop service between Cronulla and Bondi Junction, running at 12 trains an hour off-peak and 24 trains an hour on-peak. This compares with 6 trains an hour off-peak today, in a mishmash of different service patterns, and 18 trains an hour on-peak, in an even worse mishmash. Express services, running on their own tracks, would comprise of a T4 express service and an expanded South Coast service, with 3 trains an hour off-peak and 4 trains an hour on-peak starting at Waterfall, running all stops to Sutherland, then Cogra, Sydenham and Sydney Terminal, maybe also Redfern, and 3 trains an hour off-peak and 6 trains an hour on-peak South Coast line running express to Sutherland from Waterfall, then following the same pattern into Sydney Terminal. This creates a 6 train an hour off-peak express service from Sutherland, ideally aligned with every other T4 train to minimise wait times, and 10 trains an hour on-peak. From Sutherland, Cogra and Sydenham, this creates a combined 34 trains an hour on-peak. I should also add, the plan also explicitly calls for a rebuilt junction at Walleye Creek with full grade separation to get to the East Hills line. The extra space this would take up pretty much rules out the possibility of platforms on the Illawarra local lines here, so express trains physically would not be able to stop. T5 would have the most extensive new infrastructure. The new Cumberland Line tunnel from Merrylands to Epping, which stops at Parramatta Square, possibly North Parramatta and Carlingford, as well as an extension from Leppington to a new station at Bradfield South to meet an extended M2 line. The line would have continuous ETCS Level 2 cab signalling and would see frequencies of 12 trains an hour all week. This is an increase in off-peak from 4 trains an hour on T2 and 2 trains an hour on T5, and on-peak 8 trains an hour T2 and 2 trains an hour T5. Access east to the city is provided by an interchange to the M3 at Parramatta Square. Going west is more convoluted, either catching the M3 to Westmead, then changing again, or using the out-of-station interchange between Parramatta Square and Parramatta. I have an entire video on the new Cumberland line if you want to learn more. T6 would be removed in the long term, with the section between the Sefton Triangle and Bankstown forming part of the Norwestern Miranda line. More about this later. I've also made a video on this proposed line. T7 would be the only unchanged line in this plan, partly because Olympic Park would receive M3 service. T8 would benefit from dedicated new lines between Glenfield and Macarthur, including the transfer of the South Sydney Freight Line to Sydney Trains to make this section quad track, and a new extension to a Wallandilly station. Whether this means a line all the way to Wilton, or just a Southern Highlands park and ride, I'm not sure. It will likely include the transfer or rebuild of Douglas Park, Menangle and Menangle Park. T8 would be redirected to Sydney Terminal via Sydenham through a grade-separated Walleye Creek junction, and ETCS Level 2 with ATO would be fitted from Walleye Creek to Wallandilly. 6 trains an hour would run off-peak from Wallandilly to Sydney Terminal, and an additional 6 trains an hour from Macarthur on peak, an increase from current off-peak of 4 trains an hour and on-peak of 6 trains an hour. There would also be time savings travelling via Sydenham. The Southern Highlands line would use the other track pair into Glenfield before merging onto the double-track East Hills line to Sydney Terminal, running 1 train an hour off-peak and 2 trains an hour on-peak. Not related to passenger service directly, but something that would provide further separation is the proposed Minto flyover, allowing freight trains to enter Minto Terminal from the freight and intercity lines without fouling the T8 lines. T9 would be very different to what it is now, taking over the Richmond line and North Shore. Quad track from Barara to Strathfield and double tracking the rest of the Richmond line would be the infrastructure changes, and ETCS Level 2 with ATO would be installed between at least Strathfield and North Sydney. 4 trains an hour would run from Richmond to Berowra, maybe, and 2 trains an hour from Vineyard, I assume, to North Sydney, running on the suburban lines from Blacktown all the way to Central. Remember, T1 is moved to the mains, so there's no conflict here. 6 trains an hour would run the all stops Hornsby Yo-Yo. This combines to 12 trains an hour from Strathfield to North Sydney off-peak. On-peak, an additional 6 trains an hour would start at Vineyard, 6 trains an hour from Hornsby via Strathfield, and 2 trains an hour from Hornsby via Gordon. I assume the peak pattern would be Richmond line to North Sydney and Hornsby to Berowra Yo-Yos. These would combine to form 24 trains per hour from Strathfield to North Sydney. This is an increase of 6 trains an hour from Schofield's on-peak and 2 trains an hour off-peak, increase of 4 trains an hour from Hornsby via Strathfield on-peak and 2 trains an hour off-peak, and an increase of 2 trains per hour off-peak on the North Shoreline. There's actually a service cut of 4 trains an hour on-peak from the North Shore, but this is due to the removal of Central Coast via shore trains, which run fast from Hornsby to Chatswood currently. Speaking of, the Central Coast line would also get a service expansion. The CCN local service would run 2 trains an hour off-peak and 4 trains an hour on-peak, and 2 trains an hour express off-peak, increasing to 6 trains an hour on-peak. This is an increase of 2 trains an hour at all times, remembering additionally that between Berowra and Strathfield, these trains would get their own double-track line. Although metro projects aren't specifically a part of this plan, it does contain some useful information about the separate metro plans. Whereas the new pieces of infrastructure used by Sydney Trains are shown in solid lines, leading me to think there's some as yet unannounced commitment to these works, most metro extensions and the first stage of the Norwest to Miranda line are shown as dotted lines, indicating some level of uncertainty. These dotted extensions include Metro West to Randwick via Zetland, Norwest to Schofields, and Western Sydney Airport to Schofields in the north and Campbelltown in the south, almost certainly via Oran Park and Narellan. The only solid line extension to the metro in this plan is the Western Sydney Airport southern extension, one stop to Bradfield South, with an interchange to the extended T5. Service on the metro lines is also shown. Peak hour M1 service is shown to be increased to 20 trains an hour. The 2024-28 Metro Corporate Plan does suggest procurement of 23 additional trains, of which there is existing space for in both yards, by 2028. By my own maths, this would enable 24 trains an hour. Off-peak service would remain 12 trains an hour, hopefully also on weekends. Metro West, I assume the future M3, would run 12 trains an hour off-peak and 15 trains an hour on-peak, and Western Sydney Airport, maybe M2, would run 6 trains an hour off-peak and 12 trains an hour on-peak. There's another major infrastructure change that impacts nearly every line and is critical to enabling the service expansions into Sydney Terminal on T1, T4 Express, T8, and the expanded intercity services. Currently, the approach to the terminal, called the Yard Throat, is only double track, and the section through Redfern is currently signalled to allow 24 trains per hour, assuming no trains stop. The vision includes a plan to widen this Yard Throat to 4 tracks by slewing all the other lines to the east. The Illawarra lines will be empty after the T8 Sydenham service is transferred to T4 operations. I actually independently came up with a plan pretty much identical to the one in the vision in my video on the Sydney Terminal Area Reconfiguration Project. In my delusions, I'd like to think Transport copied me. If you haven't watched my video on the topic, I'll briefly explain the plan. South Coast, Southern Highlands and Southern Region trains will run from the Illawarra locals into the Illawarra Dive via a new set of ladder crossovers. They then take the dive to Redfern platforms 1 and 2, the main lines. The trains then run into Sydney terminals platform 3 to 8, I suspect they really mean platforms 4 to 8, with regional trains using platforms 1 and 2, and I think possibly 3 as well. Trains in and out of McDonaldtown Yard and Everley Maintenance Centre will run into platforms 9 and 10 at Redfern, then onto the current Illawarra locals into the flying junctions. The current Illawarra mains over the flying junctions would become completely redundant and could be removed. Inner West T2 trains would enter on the current local lines, slew across to platforms 7 and 8, the current Illawarra local platforms, then slew back across to the local lines into the flying junctions. T9 trains would enter on the suburban lines, slew across to platforms 5 and 6, the current local platforms, then slew back to the flying junction suburbans. T1, Blue Mountains and Central Coast trains would enter on the mains, cut across to the current suburban platforms 3 and 4, then run directly into Sydney Terminal on the extended steam lines, using terminal platforms 9 to 14. All other country trains would remain on the main lines throughout. In this way, Redfern platforms 1 and 2 would remain the mains, 3 and 4 change from the suburbans to the steams, 5 and 6 from the locals to the suburbans, 7 and 8 from the Illawarra locals to the locals, and 9 and 10 remain the Illawarra mains. The Central Electric platforms would mostly have the same allocations as now, with T9 using platform 16 northbound and 18 southbound, T2 using platform 17 on the city outer, then returning on platform 23 to go out to the airport, and in on platform 21 for the city inner to return to platform 19 to head to the inner west. McDonaldtown and Everleigh Day stablers would enter and leave from platform 20 and 22. There are other elements to the plan which don't really impact services that much, but would present operational efficiencies in the long term. This includes changes to stabling and maintenance, with the pages I've seen suggesting Mortdale will become stabling only, and 2 new maintenance depots will be built at Sydenham for T4, possibly T8 and T2, and Wallandilly for T8 and possibly the Southern Highlands line. This plan would completely segregate the T2, T4 and T9, significantly improving their reliability, and would provide greatly increased separation for all other lines. Combined with new cab signalling and automatic train operation, punctuality could exceed 95% on the suburban network. Sydney needs and deserves the contents of this vision. Doing so would transform the Sydney suburban network from the best in Australia to one of the best in the world. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. As usual, I'd like to extend my gratitude to my channel members for their continued financial support, and I'd like to thank you for watching.